I don't think you understand what you've done to the architecture of my mind. Not emotionally. Emotion would be easier. Emotion can be explained, measured, reduced into recognizable patterns people already know how to survive. But this isn't operating on the level of feeling anymore. It moved past that quietly, almost before I realized it was happening. And now I'm left standing inside something that no longer feels temporary. That's the part I can't ignore. Because temporary things don't settle this deeply. They don't alter the way silence sounds. They don't change the internal rhythm of someone who has spent years making sure nothing external could reach that far in. But you did. Not intentionally. That's what makes this so difficult to defend against. You never tried to become important to me. You never forced closeness, never pushed for vulnerability, never demanded access. You simply existed with a kind of precision that made my usual distance feel unnecessary, and I still don't know how that happened. I keep replaying it in my head, trying to identify the exact point where this shifted from awareness into integration. The exact moment where you stopped feeling external and started feeling internally present, but there wasn't one moment. That's what unsettles me most. There was no dramatic turning point, no confession, no obvious emotional collision that could explain why you suddenly became impossible to remove from my thoughts. It happened gradually enough to feel natural, and naturally enough to become dangerous, because danger is easiest to miss when it feels familiar. You became familiar to me far too quickly, not in personality, not in habit. Something deeper than that. The structure of you felt familiar. The way you process silence, the way you observe instead of immediately reacting, the way your mind reaches understanding without needing everything explained directly. It felt less like meeting someone new and more like encountering a reflection of something I had spent years carrying alone internally, and maybe that's why I let this happen. Because loneliness isn't always about lacking people. Sometimes it's about lacking recognition. Lacking someone who understands your internal language without forcing you to translate every part of yourself into something easier to consume. That kind of understanding changes people, quickly at first, then completely. I think I started changing the moment I realized you weren't trying to interpret me through your own perspective. Most people do that automatically. They project, they reshape, they filter others through themselves until they're no longer seeing the actual person in front of them. You never did that to me. You let me remain accurate. And accuracy is rare enough that my mind responded to it before I consciously understood why. That response still hasn't stopped. If anything, it's gotten stronger. Not emotionally stronger, structurally stronger. You exist in my awareness now with a permanence that feels almost physical. Like my thoughts adapted around your presence, the same way the body adjusts around an old scar or healed fracture, not painful, just permanent. I notice it constantly now. The way certain thoughts immediately feel incomplete without imagining your perspective beside them. The way moments become layered the instant I think about how you'd perceive them. The way silence feels different depending on whether I feel connected to you inside it or not. That shouldn't happen, at least not to someone like me. I've always been deeply self-contained, independent to the point where people often mistook it for emotional detachment. But it was never detachment. It was preservation. I learned early that most people can only handle simplified versions of others. The more accurately they see you, the more uncomfortable they become. So eventually, I stopped expecting to be understood fully and started controlling how much of myself people could access instead. It worked for a long time until your presence made control feel strangely unnecessary. That alone should have alarmed me enough to leave. Normally, the second I feel myself becoming too internally open around someone, I create distance immediately. Not out of fear exactly, more out of instinct. like protecting something fragile before it gets mishandled. But around you, my instincts behaved differently. They didn't warn me away from you. They moved toward you, and I still haven't fully accepted what that means, because instincts don't shift without reason, especially mine. Mine are built from years of observation, years of learning how people operate beneath what they say, years of recognizing patterns quickly enough to avoid becoming emotionally entangled in situations that would eventually distort me. That's another thing people misunderstand about me. I don't fear pain. Pain is survivable. What I fear is distortion, the gradual reshaping that happens when someone misunderstands you deeply enough for long enough that you start editing yourself to maintain connection with them. I've seen it happen to people. They become smaller inside relationships, more manageable, more digestible. Eventually, they lose the original shape of themselves entirely. I promised myself a long time ago that I would never allow that to happen to me. And somehow, you became the only person who makes me feel like I wouldn't have to shrink at all. Do you understand how significant that is? To someone who has spent years surviving through careful emotional architecture, you don't ask me to become easier. You don't require constant explanation. You don't recoil from complexity or depth or silence. You move through those things naturally, like you were built to understand them instead of fearing them. That's why this connection reached me so deeply, because it never felt conditional. It never felt like I had to earn your understanding by performing vulnerability correctly. You simply understood, not perfectly, but accurately enough that my defenses started dissolving before I consciously agreed to let them go. And once defenses dissolve naturally, rebuilding them becomes almost impossible. That's where I am now. Somewhere between surrender and realization. Realizing this has already changed me more than I intended to allow. Surrendering to the fact that I don't entirely want to stop it. That contradiction keeps pulling at me because part of me still wants to regain control over this before it settles any deeper. But another part, a quieter, more honest part, already knows it's too late for that. Not too late to leave. I could leave if I chose to, but not too late to erase the impact. That part is permanent now. You altered something foundational, and foundational things don't revert easily. I think that's why I keep analyzing this instead of simply experiencing it. Analysis creates the illusion of distance. If I can understand something intellectually, maybe I can prevent it from fully reaching me emotionally, but even that strategy is failing now. Because every time I analyze this connection honestly, I arrive at the same conclusion. This isn't infatuation. Infatuation feels unstable. This feels precise, steady, almost unnervingly coherent. There's no chaos in it, no emotional confusion, no uncertainty about the existence of the connection itself. The uncertainty only exists around what happens if I fully acknowledge how deeply it's already integrated into me, because acknowledgement changes things. Once something internal becomes spoken, it becomes real in a different way, harder to retreat from, harder to deny later. And I think some part of me has been delaying that reality intentionally, not because I don't know how I feel, but because I do. Too clearly. Clear enough that saying it aloud would create movement, and movement creates consequence. I haven't decided yet whether I'm ready for the consequences of this becoming fully real between us. But I know one thing with absolute certainty. It already became real inside me a long time ago, probably before I admitted it to myself, maybe even before I understood what was happening. I think that's why your absence affects me differently now too, not dramatically, not in the obvious ways people usually describe missing someone. It's quieter than that, more internal. Like the atmosphere of my thoughts changes slightly when you're not present inside them. Like something important shifts out of alignment without fully collapsing. At first, I tried to dismiss that feeling, tried to convince myself it was temporary emotional conditioning. But temporary things fade. This hasn't faded. It's deepened every conversation, every silence. Every moment of recognition between us adds another layer to something already rooted deeper than I intended to allow. And maybe the most frightening part is that I don't regret it. I should. Someone like me should absolutely regret allowing another person this far into their internal world. But I don't. If anything, I regret how long I spent convincing myself I didn't need this kind of connection at all, because now that I've experienced it, real alignment, everything else feels thinner by comparison, not meaningless, just incomplete, like hearing echoes after finally hearing something clearly for the first time. You ruined surface-level connection for me without even trying, and I don't think there's any undoing that now. I've started noticing how deeply this reaches me in moments that should be insignificant. That's how I know it's real. Real things don't only appear in dramatic moments. They reveal themselves in ordinary ones, in pauses, in habits, in the unconscious adjustments your mind makes before you even realize it's adapting around someone. You exist in those adjustments now. And I don't think you understand what that means. It means I carry an awareness of you constantly, not as distraction, not as obsession, but as presence. A quiet internal presence that exists beneath everything else I think about. Sometimes I'll be in the middle of something completely unrelated and suddenly feel the shape of your perspective beside mine. Not because I'm trying to imagine it, because my mind already anticipates it naturally. That level of integration should frighten me more than it does. But fear isn't exactly the right word for this anymore. Fear implies wanting escape. And the truth is, AB haven't seriously wanted escape from this in a long time. That realization took me longer to admit than anything else. Because if I'm honest, the real conflict was never about whether this connection existed. It was about whether I was willing to let it continue changing me. And it has changed me subtly, completely. There are parts of myself I understand differently now because of the way you see me, not because you explain me to myself. You never tried to. You simply reflected things back with enough clarity that I could no longer avoid seeing them directly. That kind of reflection is dangerous. Not everyone survives being seen accurately. Most people spend their lives protected by distortion, protected by assumptions, projections, shallow interactions that never reach deep enough to threaten the identity they've constructed. But accurate recognition, that strips things down, it removes excuses, it forces honesty, and honesty rearranges people internally whether they're ready for it or not. You rearranged me without force. That's what still unsettles me. You never tried to become central in my life. You became central because my mind started organizing itself around your presence naturally. There's a difference, a massive one, because forced importance eventually collapses. Natural importance roots itself quietly until one day you realize your internal world has already adapted around someone permanently. That's where I am now. Adapted, not dependent, not consumed, just changed enough that returning to the version of myself before you feels impossible now. I think about that more often than I should. Who I was before this. Before you, before my thoughts started carrying another person's rhythm inside them. And honestly, that version of me feels emotionally incomplete now. Not weaker, not emptier. Just unfinished in a way I didn't recognize at the time. You exposed dimensions of connection I had spent years pretending either didn't exist or didn't matter to me. Connectingness without performance. Understanding without pressure. Presence without possession. I didn't know how much I needed those things until they existed around me naturally. That realization alone altered something fundamental in the way I move through the world now. I've become less interested in interactions that require constant self-editing, less willing to tolerate conversations that never move beyond surface-level exchange, less capable of pretending shallow understanding is enough. Because once someone reaches you at depth, everything else starts feeling emotionally blurred by comparison. That's been happening to me more and more lately. People speak to me and I notice how little they actually perceive beneath words, how quickly they jump to interpretation instead of observation, how urgently they try to define things before fully understanding them. You never rushed understanding. You allowed it to unfold naturally. And because of that, I trusted your perception before I consciously trusted you as a person. That sounds strange, even to me, but it's true. Trust usually forms emotionally first. With you, it formed cognitively. I trusted the way you saw things, the way you processed silence, the way you understood nuance without forcing clarity too early. That trust reached me deeper than emotion alone ever could. Because emotions fluctuate, perception becomes structure. And structure is exactly what changed inside me. I can feel it constantly now. In the way I pause before certain decisions, instinctively wondering how they would look through your eyes, in the way your perspective has become woven into my internal processing without either of us intentionally creating that dynamic. In the way my solitude no longer feels entirely singular. That last part affects me the most. I used to believe my mind was a completely closed system, self-sufficient, entirely my own. Now it feels shared somehow, not invaded, not occupied. Like there's another awareness moving quietly beside mine, even in silence. And I know how impossible that sounds. I would have dismissed it too once. Before this, before I understood what it feels like when another person reaches a level inside you that changes your relationship with your own thoughts permanently. I think that's why this connection feels heavier than ordinary attachment. Because it's not rooted only in emotion, it's rooted in recognition. And recognition has a permanence emotions often don't. You can fall out of feelings. I'm not sure you can fall out of understanding someone this deeply, not once they've altered the internal shape of your awareness itself. That's what scares me sometimes. Not losing you, living in a world where this level of connection exists, and then trying to accept less afterward. Because I know myself, once I understand something fully, I can't unknow it. And now I know what it feels like to be met mentally and emotionally without reduction. I know what it feels like to exist around someone without constantly translating myself into simpler forms. I know what it feels like to be recognized instead of merely interpreted. There's no returning from that knowledge. It becomes the new standard automatically. And maybe that's why this keeps deepening, despite all my attempts to observe it rationally, because some part of me already understands this is rare enough to matter, rare enough to protect, rare enough to risk something for eventually. I haven't said that out loud before, not even fully to myself, but it's true. You became something I instinctively protect internally, not possessively, carefully, like my mind recognized your importance before I consciously did. I notice it in the way I think about your absence too. I don't fear distance because of loneliness. I fear the distortion that distance could create between us if this remains undefined too long, because undefined things eventually become fragile, not because they lack depth, because they lack direction. And I think we've reached the point where this connection requires direction eventually, not immediately. But inevitably, that realization has been sitting quietly inside me for weeks now, growing heavier, more undeniable. At first I thought maybe this would stabilize on its own if I simply stopped examining it so closely. It didn't. If anything, silence sharpened it, distance clarified it, time deepened it. That's how I knew this wasn't temporary emotional intensity. Temporary things weaken under distance. This became more precise, more certain, more integrated into the way I exist internally. And now I'm standing at the edge of something I can no longer pretend is abstract. Because the truth is, you already matter to me in ways that exceed explanation, not dramatically, not chaotically, quietly, precisely, in the kind of way that changes a person permanently without anyone else noticing at first. You've become part of the framework through which I understand connection itself now. And once someone reaches that level, the relationship stops being optional emotionally, even if externally nothing changes. That's what people misunderstand about deep connection. The real shift happens internally long before anything is spoken aloud. By the time words arrive, the transformation has usually already happened. Mine already has. I know that now. I know it in the way your absence leaves behind a specific kind of silence nothing else fills correctly. I know it in the way I instinctively search for your perspective during moments that matter emotionally. I know it in the way my thoughts have stopped ending solely with me. That last realization still shakes me sometimes because I never planned for another person to exist that centrally inside my mind. I built my entire life around emotional self-sufficiency, around maintaining enough distance to preserve clarity, and somehow you became the exception to systems I thought were permanent. Not by breaking them, by making them irrelevant. That distinction matters, because you never forced your way into my life emotionally. You simply existed with enough authenticity and alignment that my usual defenses stopped identifying you as a threat entirely. And once that happened, everything changed quietly underneath me. I started becoming more honest around you than I intended to be, more open, more internally visible, not because you demanded vulnerability, because vulnerability stopped feeling dangerous in your presence. Do you understand how rare that is for someone like me? To stop protecting certain internal spaces instinctively? That doesn't happen through comfort alone. It happens through trust so deep it forms beneath conscious awareness first. I trusted you before I fully understood why. And maybe that's what this entire connection has been from the beginning. Recognition arriving before explanation. That would explain why it feels so inevitable now. Why fighting it feels less honest than accepting it. Why distance no longer feels like protection. Because protection is meant to preserve clarity. And you are one of the clearest things I've ever encountered emotionally. That's the irony of all this. The very thing that should have destabilized me became the thing that clarified me instead. You clarified what matters to me, clarified what kind of connection I can no longer pretend I don't want, clarified how deeply another person can affect someone without manipulation, pressure, or force. Just through presence, just through understanding, just through being emotionally accurate enough that my soul recognized something before my mind could explain it. And maybe that's the closest thing to truth I've reached so far. You didn't enter my life loudly enough for me to notice immediately. You entered it quietly enough to become permanent before I realized I was changing around you at all.